How was that from Andy Reid? Oh, she got lots of great. Oh, well, you have done better not looking over a baby shower. Oh, yes, she did. Bridal shower, the whole.
This is banking in Washington from an obstetrician's point of view. Let me just give you a little background. Just as Sue said, once Judy and I felt we wanted to place the building uptown on the Federal Register, we learned that there's three common ways to do that, and one is the history of the person who used the building, or the history of the business that took place in the building, and then of course what you all know of is the architecture. And so after thinking about it, Judy and I decided we'd do the history of banking that took place in that building and other places in Washington, plus the architecture. It was a combination, and that's what started the study of banking in Washington. Let me just tell you my sources. I know there was a famous person, much more famous than me, that said everything I know I learned in the newspaper. And I'd say about 80% of everything I'm going to say tonight I learned in the Washington newspapers. They were very good about reporting personal lives of these bankers and their business. I also reviewed all the deeds in Pekin, and that's an exciting thing to do when you go down there and you see it all written out in the original penmanship, or since the time that William Holland William Holland was given the property on the square by the federal government, and then he sold those lots for $1.50 a piece. And that's all written down from that point on, all the deeds reported. So by doing that, I was able to learn when this property changed hands and when some of the buildings were built. And then I also found the Tazewell County Atlas and the Tazewell County Encyclopedia, published in 1879 and 1905, had some very, very important information. So that's what I've used for tonight's presentation. Now I want to tell the young bankers in the audience, we have several young bankers in the audience. I hope you didn't come expecting I was going to talk about your time. I know Malin Blumenshine, I think he worked in Peoria at one of the big city banks, and then of course Don Uphoff was president of the bank. I believe when the Danforth went to the Heartland, I think Don was the president. So, and if there are any other bankers in the audience, I apologize, I don't recognize. But we have people that worked at the bank back there. At any rate, I'm not talking about you young bankers. We're going all the way back to the 1840s. The early banks in Washington, there really are two banks we're going to talk about. The beginning was the Prairie State Bank, and then that quickly became the Danforth Bank, and then we're next going to talk about Anthony and Denhart. But the Prairie State Bank was the first bank in Washington, organized in 1848, really about the first bank in Tazewell County. There's another one in Pekin that started about the same time. But Washington had some of the first banks in Tazewell County. The Prairie State Bank was started by Asa Danforth. Later his son Almond G. Danforth worked for him. And of course, in about 1857, there was a serious banking crisis in the state. The state banks were always very fragile in Illinois. They were supported strongly by the Abraham Lincoln side of politics, the Whigs and the Republicans. The Democrats tried to get rid of the state banks constantly, and in about 1857 they were successful, and so the state banks all disappeared. And at that point, it was very convenient that Danforth, who ran the state bank, very quickly opened the private bank that we have known for so many years, the Danforth Bank. That started in about 1858. Now, Almond, or A.G. Danforth, was the president from about 1858 on. He went back and forth between running a grocery store and the bank, but about 1858 he became president of the bank, and he was president of the bank for probably 40 years. I just want to tell you a little bit about these men. Asa, who started the bank, and then his son that we know of as A.G. Danforth. Now, back in the 1840s, you didn't get your MBA or get your degree in finance and then go out and get hired at a bank. So what did you do before you started a bank? Well, he came to Washington in 1836. He was a cabinet maker. The historic Washington says he made bedsteads and chairs for many of the early pioneers. He erected a flour mill, which I believe was right down where the mill was down on Wood Street for many years, and he ran that. He was director of the Peoria and Aquaqua Railroad, and then, after doing all that, he started a bank. And in his later years, he established the first bank in town. His son, A.G., who ran the bank most of the time the bank was open, actually was in mercantile business with Denhart Snow and Company. He would go back to the bank for a few years. And then in about 1858, he became president, and from that point on, it was A.G. Denhart and Company. Now, I want to go back, it's something I forgot to say, but you don't have to see the slides, but when it was the Prairie State Bank, the Prairie State Bank was the only bank in Tazewell County that was called a bank of issue. A bank of issue means you could print your own money. Back in those days, any bank could print their own money. All the small banks in the area, or many of the small banks in the area, printed their own money. I fully thought when I said, told Sue I'd do this presentation a year ago, that someone would come and tell me I have a Prairie State bill and I can scan it and show you. But I haven't found a Prairie State bill, but they tell me you see them in collector shows from the Prairie State Bank. Back then, all banks all over the country printed money. The Eastern banks would print large amounts of paper currency in the 1840s, and they would send them out to the Wild West, the frontier, which was Washington, Illinois. This is about as far west as you went back in the 1840s. And the principle, I understand, was, according to the Tazewell County Atlas, is the further away you could send your paper money, the more valuable it was to you as a bank. Because the further away you send it, it rarely would ever come back for redemption. And so the Eastern banks flooded the area with paper money. And people didn't know how much they were worth. I mean, a $20 bill from Prairie State Bank, or a $20 bill from an Eastern bank, or a $20 bill from a Galesburg bank. The shopkeepers were never sure how much it was worth. And they had some pretty wild names for some of this money. Some of them were not even, well, they're downright nasty sounding names. Because they didn't know they might sell something for a $20 bill and they found out that the bank closed. And they would never ever be able to redeem it. So during this time, in the early days of the bank, things were very difficult with paper currency. The entire country was going from using gold as a standard to using paper currency, backed by gold. And there's a story in the Tazewell County Encyclopedia. It's just too good not to tell you. And I think it illustrates how frustrated probably the people were back then. But it says there was a Washington doctor. And of course, Washington doctors are very calm, sensitive people. They're not known for being angry or anything. So this Washington doctor took his $200 in gold into the Prairie State Bank and deposited it. Well, he went back 2 weeks later, and the cashier he wanted to withdraw his money, and he was being very nice and calm, and the cashier offered him $200 in Prairie State bucks. And it says the doctor drew his revolver and completed his withdrawal. I think that's probably true. I mean, it's true enough to be in the Tazewell County Atlas, but this was the Wild West. People carried guns, and at that point they didn't trust paper money. And there was not a standard currency in this country until someone named Abraham Lincoln was president, and one of his rivals that he appointed Director of the Treasury because he said he's the best man for the job, even though he doesn't like me. One of his rivals was the one who established a national standard in paper money late in Lincoln's first term. So that's just the background about how the banks got started and how their money. At that point, there was no trust in the money. I found out, Chris, my secretary, was good enough to come and run the computer. We found out that this computer doesn't have a zoom on it, so I apologize. But these are the places that are listed in an article written by Win Kimmel. Some of you people recognize Win Kimmel. In the 1940s, he wrote a history of the Danforth Bank, and it was published in the Tazewell Reporter.
Good.
The Danforth Bank had several locations on the square. North Main Street and Washington Street, which is right across from the historic house where the vacant lot is now. It used to be Reed's Garage. The Kroger store on the square. And then where it's been since where it was from 1903, right on the southeast corner of the square, the building that you all remember as many of us were growing up as the Danforth Bank, now known as the vacant Bank Plus building. The building, I can't enlarge it for you, but I can just tell you the building is basically the same as it was, except the facade is, the pediment has been taken off. There's some Greco-Roman columns that have been put up, and the arch entryways are now changed, but the basic building is the same as it was. And I might tell you, A.G. Danforth's old black vault door is hanging in the basement, where they had the safety deposit boxes. So that's where the Danforth Bank was until it sold out to the Heartland Bank, and obviously the Heartland Bank is still in business. Now I'm just going to list some of these bankers, and shown on the right is a picture of the Danforth family. I've already talked about Asa and A.G. I want to just talk about Henry a little bit. Henry listed himself as a banker. He was a brother of A.G. He listed himself as a banker, but I think he mostly dabbled in business and banking a little bit. He went on to an area, I think it's in the eastern part of Illinois, and formed a town and called it Danforth. And he had a bank there. Henry is mostly known, and I'm going to show you his house pretty soon. He built a house, on the corner of South Main and Holland Street that's still there. He built the Danforth Hotel, which became the city building. Now it's the BP Amical parking lot. But the Danforths, some of them are shown in this picture. And the main one I want to show you is this one right here. I'm sorry we can't enlarge it. Allman, or A.G., with his handlebar mustache, sideburns mustache, is basically the rock of the Danforth Bank. Started by his dad, but he ran the bank for 50 years. Paul Bussey, who that name will be familiar to a lot of you who grew up in Washington. Paul Bussey graduated from Washington High School. A.G. Danforth hired him as a high school student to stoke the wood stoves early every morning. He graduated in 1893 and started working for the bank immediately. And Paul Bussey became president 39 years later. And when Win Kimmel wrote his article in the 40s, Paul Bussey was still president. So that's like 50 years. And it's just kind of amazing. And then A.G. Danforth was president up to almost the turn of the century, and so that bank had very few presidents. I know there may have been one in between A.G. and Paul Bussey, but I couldn't find it if there was. And so it was a very stable bank. Now this is an interesting connection as we leave. We really don't leave the Danforth family, but George Stimson was a banker at one of the large banks in Peoria, and he fell in love with Mary Danforth. And this is Paul Stimson right here, I believe, and I think that's Mary. It's one of these ones. I think it's that one. And he fell in love with Mary Danforth, and of course, he's a banker, and so it helps to fall in love with the Danforth. So he came to Washington and was a banker in Washington. And of course, they moved into the Stimson, or they moved in to the house on South Main, and that became the Stimson, known as the Stimson House. The rest of the people here, I really don't, I wasn't going to go over them very much. I remember them very well because they all worked there at the Denhart Bank with my father. I want to just show you the major homes of the Danforths. The one that everyone will recognize at the corner of South Main and Holland, the Danforth house, now owned by the Martins. And then right across the street, his brothers, that was actually, they said, at least in the history books, it's even a larger house, H.R. Danforth's house. This is, of course, now the apartment house. Okay. Right now I'm going to switch over a little bit to Denhart Bank. But before I do that, let me just tell you that conservatism was the name of the game in the Danforth Bank. And people still remember that because I have people come into the restaurant and tell me, you know, I went in there and I tried to borrow money to start a business, and they wouldn't lend me the money. They said, you don't really need it, so you shouldn't borrow it. Basically, they're feeling throughout the entire Danforth wussy time in the Danforth Bank. And it worked as far as weathering every storm. They weathered every financial storm from 1848 up till the time they sold out the company. They never went under because they were conservative. I'm going to show you some numbers pretty soon when we talk about the Denhart Bank, but there's just completely different philosophy between the two banks on how they use their depositors' money. So this bank, the Danforth Bank is conservative. Okay, the second bank I want to talk about is the Denhart Bank. Now, Denhart Bank was started in 1866 by Charles Anthony, and Henry Denhart. This picture here is just giving you kind of an overview, and then we're going to go back and talk about these individual people. In 1885, Charles Anthony and his brother and sister left Washington to go to Peoria and open a bank, and so then it was the Denhart Banking Company. Henry Denhart, in sole charge from 1885 to 1917. In 1972, at age 75 years old, Henry Denhart probably thought, hey, I might not be working more than another 10 or 15 years. So he took some partners, Frank Cox and Harlan Kingsbury. Typical of Henry Denhart throughout his entire career, he hired people right out of Washington High School. Frank Cox graduated from Washington High School, went to work for Henry Denhart in 1885, and 32 years later bought 1/3 interest in the business. That's typical Henry Denhart approach. Harlan Kingsbury was a banker, was a salesman banker in another city, and he also bought 1/3 interest in 1917. And then, of course, some of you probably know the bank went under, and for probably about 19 years was not open, and then it was opened in 1949 by Ray Heigl as the Washington State Bank. So, and that bank is still in existence today on the west side of town. That's an overview, and I'm going to go through some from each of these eras. Okay, I apologize I can't enlarge this. I'm sorry, but this is you're just going to have to come to our restaurant to see this picture. That picture is hanging on the wall of our restaurant. It's kind of an amazing picture. It was a trading card. It's 2.5 inches in size. It was published by a photographer on the south side of the square in the 1870s. And it literally shows the bank being built. The square is mud. What I really wanted to show you with the zoom was that the construction workers are wearing black vests and derby hats. The scaffolding is like 70-foot timber, just propped up there, nothing there but a timber at an angle. And then, of course, later the building looked like this, of course. Okay, next. Okay, let me just tell you about some of the bankers at the Anthony and Denhart Bank. Obviously, the two main bankers were Charles Anthony and Henry Denhart. And they began the bank, the story goes, in the back of a dry goods store on the square in 1866. From very early on in the history of the bank, Charles Anthony's brother Clifford was a part of the bank, never ever included in any of the deeds, never really owned the bank, but he was always there with his brother. And then there's their sister, Florence Anthony, married named Patton, was also worked for them for her entire career. Now, I'm going to come back and go over some of these individual ones, and here's one right here I want to go over. Dr. R.B.M. Wilson, fascinating medical doctor who ended up working with these bankers. And I'll come back and spend a little bit of time on R.B.M. Wilson. Frank Cox, very, very important. Remember, he started working in 1885, bought a third interest in 1917. Harlan Kingsbury also bought a third interest. And I'm going to come back and talk about these three, Wilson, Cox, and Kingsbury. Let me just tell you, though, about Henry Harms and Lewis Harms, and then I will come back. Henry Harms' picture is right there, by the way, and Frank Cox's picture is right here. And those are the only two pictures that I had. That's why I put them there. Henry Harms, Lewis Harms. When you lived in Washington back in the 1880s, and you were bright and energetic, and you had an Uncle Henry, you were going to be a banker. Okay? They were nephews of Henry Denhart. He set them up in a bank in Roanoke, and according to the Washington history book, they became very wealthy as bankers. And I'm not saying it was because of their Uncle Henry, but he certainly got them started in business. The picture here, which since you can't enlarge it, it's kind of hard, but this is a picture probably about 1917 showing Henry Denhart. I believe this is Frank Cox and Harlan Kingsbury standing on the front steps of the bank. And those are the only pictures I have of Kingsbury. And the only, other than this one, the only picture I have of Cox, so I'm still looking for those pictures. But I just want to use that picture standing on the front steps to tell you about those front steps. That's where a lot of the land was sold. We have sale bills that we found up at the bank. I think we found them behind the safety deposit boxes. Some of them old sale bills, land auction bills, and they were to be sold Saturday, such and such a date, on the front steps of the Denhart Bank building. So they used those front steps for the auctioneers to stand there and auction off land. And certainly the number one business of Denhart Bank was farmlands. They mortgaged farmland all over the Midwest. So let's tell you about some of the individuals now. Charles Anthony, to start with. He was born about 1846. His family had come here from the east, from Massachusetts, but he went to Washington Primary School. I don't know where he was at. He didn't go beyond primary school in Washington because they didn't have any high school or any further schooling. But his obituary says he got liberal educational opportunities. His sister's obituary says she was sent to a boarding school in Massachusetts, so I suspect that he was too sent to Massachusetts for several years. But he worked as a clerk in R.D. Smith Dry Goods, and it said he was tutored by Smith. Smith was a shopkeeper in Washington, ran a dry goods store on the square, became very prominent in Republican politics. His store was an oasis for Abraham Lincoln because there weren't many Republicans, Whig/Republicans in those days in this area. Mostly were Democrats. So I think Smith's store was an oasis for Lincoln. And Charles Anthony purchased half interest in that store after being a clerk there for a couple of years, somewhere around 1864. His obituary, and the best sources for all this information are the obituaries. Doesn't say the year, it just says he purchased half interest. His partner, Henry Denhart, born in Germany in 1842, came here at age 11 with his family, and again, he went to Washington Primary School. He was tutored by, remember R.B.M. Wilson? I listed him as a banker. A medical doctor, R.B.M. Wilson, apparently took him under his wing and tutored him in business practices. And so Wilson's name will come up later in their business. But Henry Denhart bought the other half interest in R.D. Smith's dry goods store several years after Anthony bought the first half. And so that's where they apparently started their bank, in the back of that dry goods store. Okay. The story goes that they had a big black safe in the back of their store, like most stores would have, and people asked if they could store their money there, and they said they could, and they said when they got upwards of $10,000 in their safe, they thought we should start a bank. And so they started a bank. Now this, again, I can't enlarge this, but this says R.D. Smith. And this, obviously, is a square. This picture is taken from the State Historic Society. It was borrowed by the Washington Historic Society. This picture I first saw on one of the calendars at the Washington that you guys did several years ago. And best I can tell, that's where R.D. Smith's store was, although most of these stores moved around. As soon as they got a better spot, they moved. So it could have had several sites, but this, to me, looks like black and brown Holland's Mercantile. If you look at the cornice and you count the windows, it's exactly the same building. So I think, and then this would be where the Washington room is right now. But it's a vacant lot right now. I mean, in that picture. But they started in R.D. Smith's dry goods store. Okay, these two young men were apparently extremely energetic, very bright. They ran the dry goods store. They ran the bank out of the same building. They bought J.C. Kimbles' Lumberyard, and they ran all three of them. And it's really fascinating when you look at the newspapers that each copy of the Washington newspaper would have ads for all three of those: Anthony and Denhart Dry Goods, Anthony and Denhart Lumber, and borrow money for loan at Anthony and Denhart's bank. They all in the same ads, all in each paper. So they ran those businesses. Most of the time they were in business together. But they also invested in out west, and they were controlling partners in two cattle companies that they pastured the cattle along the North Platte River between the two new little cow towns that just in existence, much smaller than Washington at the time. We know now as Denver and Cheyenne. And they would travel routinely there by train. And a typical newspaper article about them, because the newspaper put it in every time they left town. And they'd say, Charles Anthony Henry Denhart left for the West this morning by train. These two wealthy young men will probably find some place to invest their surplus capital in something out there. Anthony became the director of mortgages for the Connecticut Mutual Life Insurance Company, with his office for that was in Omaha. They started a bank in Chatsworth, and Clifford Anthony and R.B.M. Wilson, the medical doctor, were listed as the directors of that. And then I told you they started a bank in Roanoke with their nephews. Okay. Now, R.B.M. Wilson. This fascinates me because this is kind of a connection to what was going on in those days. 1854, 1858, those of you on the Lincoln Committee, that's when Lincoln ran for Senate and lost. 1854, 1858, the year of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Those were the years that all this was going on. Well, Wilson, born in 1827, practiced medicine in Washington, starting in 1848. The newspaper said he's so well known that every incoming train brings patients for his care. He was trained in Ireland at the Royal College of Glasgow. So I think he's probably one of the few doctors in the whole area that really had medical training. And I think he drew patients to himself. He married Jane Anthony, Charles Anthony's sister, in 1854, and he tutored Henry Denhart. This is what fascinates me because I think this is the connection. I think this is how Henry Denhart and Charles Anthony got together. Because Wilson was Denhart's tutor, but he married Anthony's older sister. And I think that's how the two persons got together. The next thing that fascinates me is that the paper said he got burned out in his medical practice, and so in 1858 ran for the state legislature. So he was jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. But, he became the local representative to the state legislature in 1858. And probably because of that, when Stephen Douglas came through here in 1858, as he was moving from town to town, as they would move from town to town while they're going from debate sites to debate sites. Lincoln didn't come through here because Lincoln was no dummy. This was Democratic area. This wasn't for Lincoln's Republican Party. But Douglas came through here, and his local campaign manager was R.D.M. Wilson. So Wilson, it just fascinates me to think that these bankers might have been standing there when Stephen Douglas was talking to them. I just find that these little boys, that were not boys, but they're teenagers, standing there listening to Stephen Douglas. So I think Wilson was an important connection between Denhart and Anthony, how they got together. Okay. I'm afraid you're not going to be able to see this, so I was going to enlarge it, but these are early ads. If you look at Anthony and Denhart ads in the paper, they'd always usually be right beside each other. Here, Anthony and Denhart, Danforth here right next to Tobias, funeral furniture, casket maker Tobias. Next. And now I'm going to show you their homes. I think most of you know their homes. Obviously, you know Charles Anthony home. Charles Anthony built the house at the corner of Catherine and South Main that became known as the Stimson House all those years. Henry Denhart, of course, built the house right across the street, and since we can't enlarge this, I like this because the mud on Main Street is at least an ankle deep. The wooden sidewalks and these three little girls in their Victorian dresses that probably their mother said, "Don't you dare go in the street." Something that probably isn't as well known is this is a house at the corner of Catherine, right across from the Stimson House. This house was built by Frank Hops, who also is a banker. Now, his wife died before the turn of the century, and so he sold the house to one of Henry Denhart's nephews, Lewis Harms. But this house was actually built by Frank Hops. This is the house now that the Hipps, Rick Hipp, lives in. The porch, of course, is now brick. Right around the corner, right across from the Tobias house, is Harlan Kingsbury's house. Still stands there, looks much the same as it did back around the turn of the century when the Kingsburys were sitting on the front porch in their Victorian dresses. Okay, next. So these two banks that I've just told you about are the reason that the history of Tazewell County in 1905 stated Washington as a banking center is next in importance only to Pekin, the county seat. Now you can't see this, but there's of the three banks that have been in existence since the 1860s, two of the three are in Washington. And at that point, the Danforth Bank, starting as a Prairie State Bank, was the longest running bank still in operation. That was at the turn of the century, 1905. The longest running bank still in operation. Now, if you stop and think about it, it still hasn't closed. They've sold out to Heartland, but they're still open. So they've been open now for 160 years. So they're the longest running in 1905. They're still the longest running now, 160 years later. Next. In 1885, Anthony and Denhart separated all their partnerships: banking, dry goods, and lumber. And the newspaper, by the way, the Washington newspapers were always very complimentary. They never said anything negative about it. They said, these two young men just have more irons in the fire than the human mind can comprehend. So they had to separate. And plus, that building up there wasn't big enough for them. And so Anthony went to Peoria, formed the Anthony Loan and Trust Company, and Henry Denhart stayed in Washington. Now, these ads are right out of the paper, and I just want to show you the ads. I only copied a third of them. These are full-page ads. You can see they went from those little two-line ads to full-page ads. The interesting thing I think about this is Anthony practicing in Peoria. I mean, not practicing, I'm sorry. Working in Peoria, still advertised on the front page of the Washington paper. So I think their separation was amicable, but that didn't mean they weren't going after each other's business. Henry Denhart, another large ad, was actually on the third page of the paper. So they both continued to advertise in the paper, now as competitors. These are some neat little ads that when Henry Denhart went on by himself, and you can't read them, so, let me just read you one. It's called Hard Labor. How would you like to work 365 days in the year, all day, all night? Sounds impossible, don't it? Yet that's exactly what your money is doing when deposited in our savings department, where it draws 3% interest annually.
That's more than what this
Henry Denhart ads just became really cute when he's by himself. I mean, it's just, they're completely different. So Henry Denhart went on by himself for 32 years, and then at age 75, he took two partners, Frank Cox, Harlan Kingsbury. He sold each of them a third interest in his business for $6,000, including changing the deeds in Deacon to include their names along with all their wives' names. Business boom. They were aggressive. The lending practices, at that time they said they were lending money in 12 surrounding counties and 12 surrounding states. They were lending money to anybody who would come in the door. Things seemed like they were going real well, and then in 1929, looking backwards, I think things started to get a little shaky. Of course, 1929, the beginning of the Depression. Okay. To Washington residents, it seemed like it happened overnight, but I think it was probably going on for a year or two, and I know we're not going to be able to enlarge this, but I'll just tell you what it says. This is an extra, probably the only extra ever published by the Tazewell County Reporter, ever published or ever will be published. And it came out on a Saturday morning. It was completely devoted to Denhart Bank, closed. The state auditor came, hung a sign on the front door, closed for examination and adjustment. It went on for 2 weeks before people could even get in the door. And they not only couldn't get in and get any of their money, they couldn't get to their safety deposit boxes. So according to the paper, there was bedlam. People were banging on the doors. They tried to have citizens meetings to try to calm people down, but it really didn't work. The legal problems, let me just tell you, I'm really trying to read these. The legal problems went on for, well, I read up through 1940, but Mrs. Reinholz just brought me in 1943 Tazewell Reporter, and there's a whole page full of Denhart property that was still being sold in 1943. So the bank closed in 1930, and for 13 years they were still trying to close all of the mortgages. Basically, what people found out, they thought they owned their property, but what they found out, they didn't own their property. The bank owned their property. And so as soon as the bank failed, everybody had to either bring in their entire mortgage, pay your entire mortgage off, or the bank took your property. And that's the way it was all over the United States. There were 10,000 banks that failed in the United States, over 500 in Illinois alone.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. They took all the property and sold it because it was the depositor's money. It was the depositor's money. They sold the property, gave the money back to the depositors. Now, The Tazewell reporter did a really good job. They would publish the balance sheets, and I'm just going to tell you what they said, or they're trying to have you read them. Basically, the Denhart Bank had about $850,000 in assets. The Danforth Bank was smaller. They had only probably about $550,000 in assets. The Denhart Bank had 85% of their depositors' money loaned. The Danforth Bank had 15% of their assets loaned. Okay, just the reverse. And so when people started coming in and asking for their money, it wasn't there. But you know what? True to form, the Tazewell reporter, they always stuck up for these bankers. They said it really wasn't their fault. If people would have just been patient, not come in and ask for their money, it would never have happened.
Yeah.
Which I guess that's true. By the time this was over, their aggressive practices, actually, when they called in all their mortgages, they found out that they had mortgages in 16 counties around Tazewell County in 17 different states. And what happened when they liquidated it is the state appointed, just like they did in all failed banks, the state appointed a receiver. And Ray Heifel was the receiver, and I think many of you have heard Ray Heifel's name many times. He worked between 1930 and 1939 about, and then I just learned tonight there's still some things being sold in 1943, about $800,000 in assets, 1,000 farm mortgages, and 1,800 depositors. So what he had to do was sell these farms to get this money to pay the depositors. And about a year after they closed, they paid what they called dividends. They started out paying 5% of the depositors' money back, and then they paid another 10%. And over a period of about 7 years, they paid about 75% of the depositors' money back, which was exactly the average nationwide. That's about how much money the depositors got back. One of those pictures, one of those newspaper articles that you can read, the paper explained that was about the safest investment. Putting your money in the bank and getting 75% back was if you're on the stock market, you lost 90%, is what they meant. So people during the Depression that had their money in a bank got the highest rate of return, even though it took you 6 or 7 years to get your money back.
Huh.
Now, one of the ways they got the money back was they immediately went to Denhart, Ox, and Kingsbury and told them they had to turn in all their property. Their homes, their farms. Henry Denhart had 3 or 4 farms outside of Illinois. He sold them all. He gave the money to the bank, to the receiver. Ox had to sell his house. Kingsbury sold his house and his buildings on the square. And what they agreed to do was let Denhart keep his house for life before the state could take it. And that wasn't really being real big of him because he was almost 90 years old. The other 2 lost their homes. They were penniless. Potts had to go to live with his sister in Saybrook, Illinois. Okay. Excellent. Kingsbury went to live with his wife's sister, L.J. Danforth. He lived in Washington. Henry Denhart's property in Illinois, Iowa, Montana, and then securities valued at about $142,000 were turned over to the state. Now, he was only obligated to turn over 1/3 of a $100,000 bond. That's what this bank had. Each of them were obligated to 1/3 of a $100,000, $33,000. But he turned over $142,000. Each of the bankers agreed to turn over their property, and the paper said they actually had made it a gentleman's agreement, they called it. If they turned over their property, they wouldn't be indicted. Well, just before the property transfer took place, they found out they were going to be indicted, and that's what this headline means. Transfer real estate stands, because they tried to withdraw the transfer, but the judge said no. you're going to transfer the real estate. Okay. So they transferred the real estate and they got indicted by the grand jury. Hops, 27 counts of perjury, Kingsbury, 26 counts, Henry Denhart had fewer counts. They were all indicted, and it drug out for a number of years, but at about 90 years of age, Henry Denhart had to go to Pekin to stand trial. Now, Hops came to a tragic ending. He drowned in a gravel pit. They said they think it was an accident. As I said, he was living with his sister. He was a fisherman, and they said they think he just lost his footing and couldn't swim going down a steep bank. So he died before the trial. At the trial, Denhart was found innocent. He was quoted in the paper saying, "I've never knowingly done anything wrong." Kingsbury was convicted. The paper was extremely, they described everything. Okay? They described that it started out 8-4 in favor of acquittal for Kingsbury. After 33 ballots, the jury reversed themselves and 12-0 for acquittal. I'm sorry, for conviction. So Kingsbury was convicted. I have to digress a little bit and tell you something. Let me go back. Before the trial started, you can't read this, but it's all trials, there was a delay. There were delays, a lot of delays. And the last delay, the paper explained, was because there were no women in the jury pool. And that kind of surprised me. In the 1930s, I thought, gosh, Tazewell County is really forward-thinking. They insist on women in the jury pool. Well, so the trial went forward, and I'm sorry you can't read this, but here's the jurors, 12 men. Okay? So I guess they figured women should be in the jury pool, but they don't have any place on the jury. I sort of expected that for the 1930s, so I wasn't surprised. At any rate, Kingsbury was convicted. Next. Over the next year and a half, Kingsbury it went through the court system all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it's sort of an incredible story. Again, it's all detailed in everything. They arrived at the Supreme Court hearing. The Supreme Court justices were there. Kingsbury was there with his lawyer. The state's attorney didn't show up. The court, you can imagine, the court was very angry. They reprimanded the state's attorney. They overturned the conviction and said he cannot be tried again. So Kingsbury was eventually found innocent after it went through the circuit, the appellate, and the Supreme Court. Okay, just about a year after their trial, this picture appeared in the paper of Henry Denhart's death. Of course, on the front page, he was loved by the entire community. And I think people probably were almost surprised to see it, even though he was almost 91 years old, because I think people thought he's just going to always be there. But Henry Denhart passed away. I think someday somebody might do a historical society presentation on Henry Denhart, because he's just an amazing person, a leader in the Lutheran Church throughout the entire country. He built most of Carthage College. He built most of the Lutheran Church here in town. Sunday school superintendent. I mean, it was all detailed in about a 3-page obituary in the Tazewell Reporter. So, okay, next. Okay, now let me just breeze over this. At the time the bank closed, banks were closing all over the country, and aid was rushed by 2 presidents. The Depression started under Hoover, and Hoover tried to rush aid through Congress, economic stimulus. Sound familiar? And that was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which lent $7 billion to banks. Which you can imagine in terms of the money back then, how much money that was. The Land Bank Association started under FDR in 1933 with loans to property owners, trying to help them keep their property. And those articles over there, which you can't read, I'll just tell you, there was a local person here who helped who helped Ray Heupel, but it seemed to me that they got started a little late. I mean, this article is from 1934. They only had about $70,000 worth of federal loans applied for. So the federal assistance that saved a few banks came way too late to save the Denhart Bank. And only about 10% of all the banks in Illinois that were closed, of the 500 banks that closed in Illinois, only about 50 actually reopened. They got the loans, they got their property paid off, and reopened. I'm gonna skip. Now, here's, I do want to tell you about this, even though you can't read it. But in 1937, Ray Heupel had closed most of the loans. He still had some stragglers, but at that point, he put the bank building up for sale. And he did it the same way he sold all of the property that the bank took over. He would get a bid on the property, and then he would put that bid in the newspaper, and he would put it in the Tazewell Reporter on the front page 2 consecutive weeks. And it was like going to a silent auction. You know, you see something you like, you write your name down. That's what people would call over, stop by the newspaper office and say, well, I saw that bid and I want to raise it by $500. Well, the bid started out at $4,500, and several Washington people bid. And then the final week, it said there's 2 Washington people that were bidding. And then the next week, it said the bank was sold to Frank Main of Peoria, who's in the realty department of the Commercial National Bank. He hadn't even been bidding, but that's who bought it. And Mr. Main said in the newspaper, it's just such a well-built building, and I just bought it for a good investment. And that's the last I saw in the papers. But I reviewed all the deeds, and 6 weeks after Frank Main bought it, he transferred the deed to Ray Heupel. So Ray Heupel actually bought it. But I never saw that in the paper. But that's how Ray Heupel ended up at the bank. And a lot of you know that he started the bank in that building, and about 10 years later. Okay, we'll go on. Next. Okay, I was trying to come up with a way